We are live on ABC's KMET 1490 AM.com. Your number one spot right here for news and talk on the West Coast. I thank everyone for tuning in this morning. On the telephone line, I welcome to the program a six-time All-Star Major League Baseball pitcher who led the American League in strikeouts 5 times. I welcome to the program Sam McDowell. Sam, honored to have you. Brian C.
Thank you. Good to be here, Brian.
My pleasure, Sam. So let's begin, Sam. Early 1960s, a week shy of your 19th birthday, you make your Major League Baseball debut for the Indians versus Cookie Lavagetto's Minnesota Twins. And right off the bat, you left an impression pitching 6.2 scoreless innings. What do you remember most about your opening day debut?
Well, actually, not that much other than I broke 2 ribs trying to throw a fastball to Jim Lemon a little bit harder than I should have. And I heard pop, pop, and then I couldn't breathe, so they took me out of the game, took me to a hospital, and found out I had 2 broken ribs. So that ended my career for that year.
Wow, but I mean, 19 years old, here you are, a teenager. You must have been, signing that contract with the Indians, you must have been in awe. One of the most, they tell me it's one of the most hardest things to get drafted or, signed with a Major League Baseball team. How are you feeling as a 19-year-old that the Indians wanted you?
Well, to be quite frank with you, back in the day, I wasn't thinking anything either way because I really didn't know, understand, or appreciate the entire situation because since that time I was 6 or 7 years old, I played sports every single day of the year. As you probably know in my bio there, I played every sport in grade school and high school, from football, basketball, baseball, cross country, and tennis. And so every single day I was doing something. I never heard a baseball game on the radio, never saw one, never went to a game, even though in high school I pitched batting practice for the Pittsburgh Pirates because our high school was right next to Forbes Field. And so they wanted me to kind of entice me so that when it came time for me to sign a contract that I would consider them more than any other team, I guess. But anyhow, I pitched batting practice both my junior and senior year for them. But I didn't get a chance to stick around because I had to get home, do homework or whatever, because I had school the next day and had to get up at 6 o'clock. And as you know, back in those days, the game didn't start till 8, didn't get over till 11 or 11:30, which means I'd probably get home at 12:30 or 1 before I could even think about going to bed. So I never saw a game until I pitched one in Lakeland, Florida, my first professional game of baseball.
That's amazing. Now, when you first came up to the major leagues, early 1960s, fans were already comparing you to the great Bob Feller. Did that bother you? How did you feel about that, like living in the shadow of another great Cleveland pitcher, Bob Feller?
Well, again, it's difficult because back then, being so young and not really realizing where I was and what it was that I was doing, because basically I just, in my mind, mentally had continued over from being an amateur to a professional the same way, and that was I was just enjoying a sport that I had lots of fun with, enjoyed playing, and that was my mindset most of the time while I was in the major leagues. It wasn't until I'd say probably 65 or 66 that I started to semi-wake up and realize where I was and what I was doing. As I said, I really wasn't a baseball or any sport aficionado back then.
So it just, you just had that natural ability, to throw the fastball, because you were the, for me, Sam, you were the most, from the mid-60s to the early 70s, you were the most dominating American League pitcher, in the game. The only other person in the American League during the mid-60s to the early 70s that I can think of second would probably be Whitey Ford. I mean, you were dominating the game from 62 to 69, 70. There's no question about it.
Well, I appreciate that. But in my particular case, I was very fortunate that I had a father who had played every type of sport growing up in his life. He was quite an athlete. In fact, I don't know if you looked at the background or not, but he was the quarterback for the University of Pittsburgh that went to the Rose Bowl, the first Rose Bowl ever, and punter for them. But he had played football, baseball, and basketball for Pitt, and while he was studying engineering. Then he had switched and went into pre-med, which had later on, because he was interested in becoming a dentist, but later on, he was able to help me kind of get everything put together, working as a machine, because he knew and understood the human body and was able to explain to me certain things that were needed to be done to throw a curveball, a fastball, a slider, a changeup, and so on. In fact, when I came to the big leagues, that's a big story in there in my book that I had written just lately. But when the Cleveland Indians signed me, they brought me to Cleveland for 3 days prior to sending me to D-ball down in Lakeland, Florida, to take a look at me to see what Mel Harder, the pitching coach at the time, in the major leagues, thought I should be working on in the minor leagues so that they could tell the pitching coach and manager that where they were going to send me. And in fact, in an article that was in the newspapers, when asked about, well, that kid that you brought up, McDowell, and you signed, what does he need to work on? And Mel Harder said, nothing. All he needs is experience. He's got every pitch, major league pitch that I've ever seen and the best I've ever seen. So there's no need to work mechanically with him. He just needs experience. And that was all brought about because of my dad, who once he saw what was in me physically and how that came about was back in the day, we didn't have Little League when I was first growing up, 7, 8, 9 years old, and so on. So my dad, who was coaching a 13 and 14-year-old team, back then it was called Pony League, he would allow me to have a uniform, but I would sit on the bench. During practice, obviously, he'd let me hit, let me play in the outfield, and so on. But during a game, he would never let me play because I really wasn't ready. And then one day we were leading by 7 runs in the 5th inning, and back then we only played 7 innings. And so he put me in center field thinking I couldn't make too many mistakes out there. And the opposition had a runner on second when a player hit a ground ball out to center field. I fielded it and threw the runner out at home plate. And when my dad saw that, from that day on, he would work with me in the backyard becoming a pitcher because he said that he didn't realize that I had that strong of an arm. And so from that day forward, every chance he got in his free time, he would work with me, all my brothers, because we were all athletes. In fact, I had an older brother that I continually say was a better pitcher than me at the time, who eventually wound up getting polio and paralyzing his right side. But my dad would work with him at football because he loved football. Became a great quarterback for my high school team. He had worked with my younger brother in basketball because he loved basketball, and so on. So we had an entire family of 5 brothers, and each one of us basically was pretty doggone good at our particular sports.
It's really amazing. I mean, we're talking baseball with the great Sam McDowell, who during his heyday led the American League in strikeouts 5 times, twice topping 300. His 2,453 career strikeouts ranks 45th of all time in baseball history, who's with us today. I mean, those are impressive numbers, Sam. There's no doubt about it. 2,453 career strikeouts, ranking top 45 of all time in baseball history. Amazing.
Well, I appreciate that.
So I mean, you were a true strikeout artist, Sam. And if we look back, I mean, even if we go way back to '61, you led the PCL in strikeouts, I believe, 1 year.
Yeah, well, that was in '62. Basically, I led the PCL in everything, pitching-wise. Plus, that was my first no-hitter. Was back in '62, and then later on in '64, I had another no-hitter. And ironically, it was against the team that I had used to pitch with when I was there in '62. But I led the PCL both years that I was out there and everything in a category of pitchers.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. It really is crazy. It's amazing. I mean, I wanted to ask you, what was your method to striking out hitters? Pitch them high and tight inside?
Well, and basically, I was just a thrower up until 1964. I didn't know, had no concept of pitching, what the science was, what to do, when to do, how to do it, and so on. In fact, that was my problem. For the first couple of years when they brought me up to the major leagues, I had no idea where I was, what I was doing, and so on. And they had nobody that could really work with me because back in the day, the only thing that they used to try and fix with an individual was mechanics. And with me, I had perfect mechanics, so there was nothing they could ever do with that. My problem was not only wildness, but not understanding pitching and the science of it. And that didn't come until later on when Alvin Dark and Jack Sanford became my pitching coach and manager, respectfully. So I just was a thrower, and I would just fire the ball any way I possibly could, whatever the catcher was calling at the time. And, of course, being in the minor leagues back then, we were all trying to learn what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and so on, because you really didn't have basically the coaching that you have today.
Right, and then by 1965, the league, they were already comparing. They were saying, I know news reports were saying that you were the American League version of Sandy Koufax. I don't know if you heard that.
Well, yeah. In fact, that year they had a Sports Illustrated magazine where they had me on it, and the headline was "Better than Koufax" with a question mark.
Oh, yeah, really?
And yeah, that's one of the big collector's items that you guys always want autographed these days.
Yes.
But I really didn't compare myself with anybody because, as I said, I really wasn't in that type of a world of really knowing and understanding and appreciating where I was and what I was doing yet. That came later on. But I'd also been friends with Sandy because we had spring training out in Tucson, Arizona, and for whatever reason, Gabe Paul, the general manager, was pretty good friends with the O'Malleys. So every year that the Dodgers would leave Vero Beach and start west, they would wind up in Arizona, and the Cleveland Indians and the Dodgers, we would barnstorm through Mexico, all through little towns throughout California, the week or 10 days before the season would actually start. And during that, because we would stay at the same hotel and so on, I would meet up with Sandy or go to dinner with Sandy, or we kind of always mixed it up together because we were always together throughout that barnstorming period every year. That went on for like 6 or 7 years there. So I got to know Sandy pretty well. And, of course, there were so many. Everybody and their brother wanted to photograph with Sandy and me throughout the entire time. You know, we went through the barnstorming. So we got to know each other pretty well.
And then I want to ask you about 1965. You make it to the All-Star team. That was the first of 6 appearances for you.
Yeah,
How was that experience like?
I apologize, but I'm starting to lose you. I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I want to bring up 1965, making it to the All-Star team, your first appearance in the All-Star game. How was that experience like for you?
Well, I was just in awe of everybody that was there because, as I said, that was still during the period of time that I call my fog that I was in, where I really wasn't aware of everything like I should have been. And I just remember sitting in the locker room looking at all these superstars and kind of wondering why I was there, And I remember the one time I was sitting right next to Harmon Killebrew on one side, and on the other side, Mickey Mantle. And I just was in awe, not knowing what, where, when, and how still then. And then when, of course, they called on me in the middle of the game to come in relief, I mean, I just was still that type of a guy where I was just firing the ball as hard as I could, as often as I could, whatever the catcher was calling, and really didn't understand the science completely, although in 64 I started to learn a little bit about the science of pitching, which was so important.
Yeah, and then, another big year in your career, just going through your bio, 1968, you beat out Denny McLain for the strikeout title. 283 Sam McDowell, 280 Denny McLain. So you guys were head-to-head, huh? 68?
Well, as it turned out, we were head-to-head. But of course, at the time, neither one of us really knew much about that because we didn't really keep focus on strikeouts, the numbers or what have you. We were more interested in just whether we could win or lose and what have you. But that was also the year that Denny, in pitching against Cleveland, learned the hard way, and he was never able to beat us again after that. But that was a year that Denny made the statement when he was in Chicago. He had just won a game against the White Sox. And in his interview, he had said, boy, he can't wait to get to Cleveland where he can relax, referring that it wasn't much of a job pitching against the Cleveland Indians. And so I had asked Alvin Dark, my manager, if he could switch my pitching rotation so I could face Denny. And that was the day that, the last day that Denny ever came close to beating the Indians. No matter how many times he pitched after that, he became one of our favorites. And in that particular game, he didn't last very long. I think it was 4 innings or 5 innings. I'm not sure what it exactly was. But that was also the game that I had, I believe it was 14 strikeouts in 6 innings.
Right. And then another momentous, year in your career was 1970. First year you win 20 games. How did that feel like, Sam?
I apologize. I couldn't hear you.
No, another momentous year in your career was 1970. First year Sam McDowell wins 20 games. How did that feel like?
Well, that felt good because by then I knew and understood how important winning 20 games was, even though I never got a raise from it with Gabe Paul as the general manager. And that's an entirely different story all in itself. But to me, the greatest years that I did have was, number one was 64, when they finally brought me up from the minor leagues, when I kind of dictated what, where, when, and how, because up until that time, all the managers would call my pitches in the major leagues. And, of course, I didn't do well, and they'd send me back to the minor leagues. In the minor leagues, I would just set on fire. I had no problem. It was relatively easy. But down there was nobody calling my pitches, and there was nobody that helped me, so I was left on my own and did fantastic. As you know, in 64, I was 8-0 with I believe it was a 1.67 earned run average. I was averaging 12 strikeouts a game, had a no-hitter and 3 one-hitters, and so on. And then Bertie Tebbetts at the major league level was calling my pitches all the time. So when Gabe Paul called me, I was 7-0. And he called me and said, Sam, we want you to come to L.A. to pitch against the Angels tomorrow. And I said, I'm not coming. And I said, I told you in spring training that as long as Bertie Tebbetts was manager, or as long as he was going to call all my pitches, and then I get punished for it, I said, I'm not coming up. I also wasn't trying to be arrogant, but I knew the rules. I knew that if I stayed in the minor leagues, that Cleveland would lose me in the draft. So I was willing to leave the Cleveland Indians because, to me, it was just so frustrating coming to the big leagues, having the managers call my pitches, and when I didn't do well, send me back to the minor leagues. But yet in the minor leagues, I was not left on my own and always did my own thing, and there you go. I was 8-0 eventually. But anyhow, Gabe Paul told me he would bury me in the minor leagues and hung up. So we went on to Hawaii, and I was pitching in Hawaii the first year that Hawaii was in a PCL. And I won a game there, pitching a one-hitter and striking out, I believe it was 18 batters and so on. So when we arrived back in San Diego, I get a phone call from Gabe Paul, and he says, have it your way. Come up to the major leagues, and we're going to have you pitch against Washington tomorrow. And I said, is Bertie Tebbetts going to call my pitches? And he said, no. He said, I talked to Bertie, and he's going to leave you alone. I said, okay, I'll come there. And basically, that was extremely important for me, not because I was that arrogant or wanted to be that arrogant, but I really had nobody helping me or understanding the game and the science of pitching. And it wasn't until the following year when they hired Alvin Dark and Jack Sanford, where Jack Sanford would sit on the bench and he would explain the science of pitching to me. He would go over the previous inning, the mistakes I made. He would go over the coming inning as to what I need to do with this hitter and that hitter and so on. Was a tremendous help for me in teaching me how to pitch. And that's when the first time I could say I was actually a pitcher, even though I was a pitcher in '64, but didn't realize how much I had learned in the minor leagues by trial and error. And to me, that was the most fabulous thing for me personally in gaining some pride and some self-confidence. And then, of course, in '68, I mean, I had a 181 earned run average. I had over 300 strikeouts, and I couldn't win 20 games. That tells you how our hitting was.
Yeah, and like you mentioned 64, Sam, but 65, you strike out 325, 66, 225, 67, 236, 68, 283, 69, 279 strikeouts, 1970, you strike out 304 batters. I wonder, was there ever a batter that gave you some trouble, some difficulty facing?
Frank Howard owned me. No matter what I threw to Frank Howard, he would hit it out. In fact, the JFK Stadium up in the upper deck in center field, which is, I guess, 550 feet or something like that, there's 3 white seats that they painted up there. One of those I'm responsible for. No matter what I did with Frank Howard, he, as I said, he owned me. He hit me. I hit him as much as I could, knocked him down. Nothing mattered. And that's the reason why I'm in a record book as the last left-handed second baseman in the history of baseball with a fielding average of 1,000. Because Alvin Dark worked out a deal with me that when I was pitching against Washington and I was winning by the 7th inning by under 2 runs, every time Frank would come up, he'd take me out of the game, put me in right field, or take me off the mound, put me in right field, bring Dean Chance in to get him out, and then there he was. I come in and finish the game.
Oh, man. I wanted to ask you about the Cheers TV show, Sam, but we're out of time. Listen, it was really an honor to have you.
I enjoyed it. Brian, take care.
Take care of yourself. That was the legendary pitcher, Sudden, Sam McDowell. Until next week, happy collecting to all.